Hey guys, it's Tristanator here, and welcome to the long-term review of the Moto G200, a phone that I'd imagine nobody knows existed in 2021. It's this, the Moto G200. It was the successor to the Moto G100 that I made a first impressions video on way back in, I believe, the tail end of 2021. I had this phone for 3 years and counting. So yeah, it was kind of a weird transition period. You go from having admittedly a plastic backed Motorola phone that barely anybody knew anything about. Most of my friends and the people that I knew at the time had iPhones, Samsungs, or potentially even a Google Pixel. But that's kind of like for the Android people that do not have a Samsung. Yeah, those are kind of the big three, and then Motorola and Nokia are kind of just there. Nokia, especially so, given that, well, the Nokia name has been completely scrapped for HMD Global's new phones, but that's probably going to be discussed in another video at some point. Having a look at the budget realm of mobile phones, smartphones, but yeah. It was a weird transition period going from the Moto G100, which had a plastic back, but it just had this amazing sort of iridescent ocean color wave that it just looked rather magical just in the light, being able to see almost like a Northern Lights aesthetic on a phone with like blues and purples and greens, just all together in a quite frankly a beautiful, dazzling finish on a phone, and I do miss it in that regard. But for all of its highlights, with having a Snapdragon 870 processor, which basically meant that you could play anything on the Play Store at the time, or its dazzling design, or the fact that you could take ultra wide selfie shots, which is kind of pointless now, given that a variety of phones now have even wider selfie cameras. So it basically means that there isn't really a need for like a very specific niche ultra wide selfie camera. And I guess also it meant, well, given that pretty much all Android phones now have the camera up top here, the Moto G100 has a main camera there and an ultra wide camera just off to the side there in the corner, which as far as like an aesthetically pleasing display, it really wasn't there. So as you can see, you can probably see it now, the camera is there in the top of the display. But yeah, both phones had similar displays. I think the Moto G100 had a 6.7 inch display. The Moto G100 has a 6.8 inch display, so ever so slightly bigger. And of course, the aspect ratio, it went down from a 21:9 aspect ratio, which is kind of used for like a cinematic aspect ratio for displays. It went down to a 20:9 display, which is kind of it's the kind of display that most flagships would go for. The phone basically just became more balanced compared to the G100. The G200 has a 108 megapixel camera on top of a 13 megapixel ultra wide camera instead of a 16 megapixel. So on paper it's a downgrade, but mainly because this came out later, you would imagine that the color science as well as the image processing of the Snapdragon 888 Plus chipset, you would think because it's newer, the camera processing should be a little bit better. and a two megapixel depth sensor, which unfortunately is the kind of thing that you would see from the rest of the Moto G lineup even now. But times changed. The Moto G200 was the most powerful Moto G ever, despite not being named as such. That was the G100. The G200 was kind of this weird stage in Motorola's flagship aspirations, I guess, for phones, because I'd imagine what happened was back in 2021 you had the Edge 20 Lite, the Edge 20 and the Edge 20 Pro, and those were phones that didn't necessarily sell well compared to the competition, especially if you compare it to the likes of Samsung A52s, which were just more balanced phones as far as like the camera tech and the kind of performance you would get with the Snapdragon 778G. So it was kind of a case where, as far as like mid-range and flagship phones, Motorola weren't really there. So they decided to take the Edge 20 camera sensor of the 108 megapixel camera, put it into a more affordable device, make sure that this phone doesn't have an OLED screen. It has an LCD, which basically means that the top brightness level that you can get with this phone, despite it being genuinely a beast, it can run literally any app on the Play Store, and time has definitely been kind to this phone. After 3 years, you can still play the likes of Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail and Zenless Zone Zero that has only recently come out from the Hoyoverse studio, and Call of Duty Warzone Mobile. You can play all of these games basically on top settings. The phone will overheat to oblivion whilst trying to play these games, and even though this phone is pretty old now, it has 128 gigabytes of storage. Budget phones and mid-range phones have had 128 gigabytes for a while now, but you kind of had to pay mid-range pricing at 3 years ago in order to get 128 gigabytes standard. If you take a look at the iPhone side of smartphones, it was only up until the iPhone 13 back in 2021 where Apple decided, you're going to get 128 gigabytes as standard instead of 64. So technology definitely has it's trickled down from the flagship area of the smartphone market to mid-range at around the £400 mark, and then all the way down to the budget segment, which is, I would imagine, I would class it to probably £300 and below. So it's kind of the perfect phone. For £400, you get a large screen, you get a flagship chipset, which outdid even the S21 and the S21 Ultra, with the Plus variant of the 888 chipset. You had a pretty dependable, solid camera system that can get tons of detail with 108 megapixel shots, and even if it pixel binned all the way down to 12 megapixels, it's still a very detailed shot that can even rival the likes of Google Pixels, even though Google Pixels are definitely they're a lot more tuned to the idea of color science and just picture quality in general after the shot has been taken. And video as well, you can record 8K resolution video, which is not terribly useful unless you're a professional and you need to record at that level. But this can easily handle 4K 60 if you want to pare that down. Compare that down to 4K 30 or even 1080p 60. doesn't really matter. But it's just this phone can do anything, which is I'm glad I got it. It was basically the best tech purchase I've ever made, and it's just a more balanced experience, because if you compare it to the Moto G phones now, they've definitely made it so that you don't really get too many nice features unless you step up to the Edge series of phones, and Moto G's top range is basically just the Moto G82 from 2022, the Moto G84, which came out in 2023, 2024's Moto G85. You have OLED screens now that can go up to well above 1000 nits of brightness. That basically means that you can have the phone outdoors and the sun is shining directly onto the display, and it's perfectly readable. Whereas, with an LCD display, even though this is, it's powered by a flagship chipset, albeit from one from 2021, it has the kind of performance that will last years into the future, and it already has, and for many more, hopefully. The brightness of the phone just isn't that bright. like I've been out with it, and the phone is practically boiling as it's trying to deal with the sunlight's heat on the display. And it's kind of hard to read the content even on max brightness. So it's kind of one of the benefits of going for an OLED screen nowadays. The screen can go brighter than 600 nits as standard. So yeah, it's kind of crazy how tech has evolved with smartphones over the last few years. The budget segment hasn't really changed all that much. The mid-range segment has basically been able to transform the idea of basically what do you want from a smartphone, because in 2021 your choices were get a flagship or go for a mid-ranger like the G200, or the closest competition this had was probably the A53, I think, in sort of like early 2022. Samsung's A52 series was pretty good, but again, like this phone absolutely demolished it in performance. So I was basically like, well, if I'm spending £400 on a phone at the time, it's the best. Like it's just the best phone that you could get for £400, and it kind of just represents a journey that Motorola took, where they didn't really know how to classify its flagship phones, and so they went with a phone that basically could do it all. And unfortunately, it just didn't get the software support that it should have got. It should have been able to get more than one Android update. It's stuck on Android 12. Every other phone now is basically on Android 14, unless you go for a budget phone that was permanently stuck on Android 13. But yeah, quite a wild ride when it comes to Motorola's tech aspirations. The phones are more colourful, they're artsy, they're a lot more appealing, but as far as like raw specs go, no other phone has beaten this phone for me. And Samsung clearly loves to just throw in very weak Exynos chipsets into their mid-ranges. So the cameras are great, the performance isn't, and the same goes with the Google Pixel. So we'll see what succeeds my Moto G200, but as far as like specs go, this is the best. This is the best value phone I've ever seen. But thank you for watching, and I guess one final thing is, they didn't put a headphone jack on this phone. So sadly, wired earphones, they don't work. The G100 had a headphone jack. To be honest, that was probably the perfect Moto G phone, but the G200, for its flaws of not having a headphone jack, it's probably the most balanced Motorola phone that they've ever made for the price. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. But until then, Tristanator out.